It was a humid August afternoon, and Brendan, a college student from Little Rock, Arkansas, was getting restless as the summer drew to a close. His best friend Luke was equally bored. They'd exhausted all their usual spots and were looking for something different, something that would shake up the lazy rhythm of their days. That's when Brendan remembered a strange app he'd heard about online, Randonautica, a tool people use to explore random coordinates, sometimes leading to eerie discoveries. Brendan brought it up, and Luke's eyes lit up with excitement. After a quick download, they set their intention as something unusual and let the app do its thing. The app's first location was a bust, a fenced-off backyard. The second directed them to an abandoned building, but a no trespassing sign stopped them from exploring further. Just as they were about to call it quits, they decided to try one last time. This time, the app generated a spot on the outskirts of town, in a quiet, forested area neither of them had been to before. Brendan felt a twinge of apprehension as they navigated the winding roads leading them further into the trees, but he pushed it aside, reminding himself it was just an app. It couldn't really lead them anywhere dangerous. When they arrived, the road narrowed into a dirt path, and it was clear they'd have to walk the rest of the way. They parked the car and set off, their footsteps crunching over the forest floor. The sun was beginning to dip lower, casting long shadows across the trail. The silence felt thick, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves overhead. Brendan found himself glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something behind them, but the path was empty, stretching back into the shadows. About 10 minutes into their walk, they spotted something strange by the side of the path. A thin branch was jabbed into the ground, and a small, crumpled piece of paper had been skewered through it, flapping gently in the breeze. Brendan's curiosity got the better of him. He unfolded the paper, revealing a note written in jagged, hurried handwriting. It read, "Leave your phone number." Brendan felt a chill run down his spine. He showed it to Luke, who snorted but encouraged him to open the paper further. Inside, in the same frantic handwriting, was an additional message. "Give me your address, and I'll send you what you seek." The words were vague but unsettling, stirring a strange sense of unease in both of them. Despite the creepy feeling settling over him, Brendan shrugged and, on a dare from Luke, scribbled down an old Google Voice number he had saved for pranks. He put the note back on the branch and took a step back, glancing around. That's when something else caught his eye. A few feet from the path was a large fallen tree trunk, and draped across its rough bark were several brass, red, gray, black, each one carefully placed as if arranged in some disturbing ritual. Brendan's stomach twisted. The sight was so bizarre, so out of place, that they both froze. An unsettling silence surrounded them, and for the first time, Brendan questioned if they should have come here at all. For a few tense moments, Brendan and Luke just stood there, staring at the brass draped over the fallen tree. The scene felt disturbingly intentional, as though someone had placed each item with purpose. The vibrant colors, red, gray, black, seemed unnatural against the dark, earthy tones of the forest, almost too clean, as if they'd been placed there recently. Brendan felt his skin crawl. The items were personal, intimate, yet they were abandoned here in the woods, creating a sinister sense of trespassing into someone else's hidden space. Luke broke the silence with a forced laugh, but Brendan could hear the nervous edge in his friend's voice. "Okay, this is officially creepy," Luke muttered, casting a wary glance around them. The forest was silent, with no sounds of wildlife, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. The longer they lingered, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, like an unseen force pressing down on them, urging them to leave. Brendan felt the hair on the back of his neck prick up, a primal warning he couldn't ignore. He tried to shake off the feeling, reminding himself it was just an old tree and some forgotten items, but something in his gut told him there was more to it than that. Just as they were about to turn back, Brendan spotted something else near the base of the tree, partially hidden under a thick layer of leaves. Driven by a mix of dread and curiosity, he crouched down and brushed the leaves aside, revealing two small, dusty packages. He froze as he recognized what they were: condom wrappers, faded but intact. Next to them lay a small metal pot, blackened from soot, as if someone had used it to start a fire. The implications sent a chill through him, unsettling images flooding his mind. Luke leaned over his shoulder, his face paling as he took in the strange scene. "What the hell, man? This doesn't look right." His voice was barely above a whisper. The bras, the condom wrappers, the pot, it all painted a disturbing picture. Brendan could sense the same unspoken fear in Luke's eyes. The fear that they'd stumbled onto something private, something dark that wasn't meant to be found. They rose to their feet, an unspoken agreement hanging between them to turn around and get out of there. But as they stepped back, a faint sound broke the silence. A metallic clinking noise, like a chain shifting against metal, echoing faintly from somewhere deeper in the woods. Brendan and Luke froze, exchanging wide-eyed glances. The sound was so out of place, so distinctly human, that it sent a surge of fear through both of them. Brendan's mind raced, grasping for an explanation, but the rational thoughts slipped away, replaced by a deep-seated sense of dread. Luke tugged at Brendan's arm, his face tight with fear. "Come on, let's go," he whispered urgently. But Brendan found himself unable to move, his gaze drawn toward the shadows between the trees, where the sound seemed to have come from. The forest felt alive, its shadows shifting and closing in around them, making it feel like they were being watched, like something unseen was lurking just beyond their sight. As the eerie clinking faded into the silence, Brendan and Luke's instincts screamed at them to leave. The forest around them seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as if the shadows themselves were breathing. Every instinct in Brendan's body was on high alert, telling him they had intruded on something that should have remained undisturbed. Luke tugged at his arm, more insistent this time, his voice barely a whisper. "We shouldn't be here. Let's get out of here now." They turned to head back toward the car, their pace quickening with each step. But as they walked, Brendan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. The dense silence was punctuated only by their hurried footsteps, but he could feel something watching them, its gaze heavy and unrelenting. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, and with every passing moment, the once familiar trail seemed to twist and change, as though the forest were trying to trap them in its depths. Suddenly, a new sound broke the silence. A low, scraping noise, like metal being dragged across the forest floor. Brendan stopped dead in his tracks, his heart seizing in his chest. The sound was faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere off the path. He glanced at Luke, who was wide-eyed, his face drained of color. "Did you hear that?" Brendan whispered, his voice trembling. Luke nodded, his mouth slightly open, unable to speak. They stood frozen, straining their ears as the sound grew louder, closer. It was accompanied by the faintest whisper, a voice carried by the wind, almost too soft to hear. The words were indecipherable, but they carried a menacing, otherworldly quality that chilled Brendan to the core. He didn't want to know who or what was making that noise. Without a word, they broke into a sprint, their feet pounding against the ground as they dashed down the trail. The forest blurred around them as they ran, each step feeling like it barely put distance between them and the haunting sounds. As they neared the edge of the path, the trees seemed to close in, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers trying to grasp them, hold them back. Finally, the car came into view, and Brendan felt a surge of relief. They didn't stop running until they reached the vehicle, yanking open the doors and scrambling inside, slamming them shut with trembling hands. Luke jammed the key into the ignition, his hands shaking so badly he could barely turn it. The engine roared to life, and without hesitation, he threw the car into reverse, tires skidding as they sped back down the narrow road. As they drove away, Brendan glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone emerge from the trees. But the path remained empty, cloaked in shadows, as if swallowing their escape in silence. A suffocating dread settled over him, the kind that he knew would stay with him for days. They didn't speak for the rest of the drive, the weight of what they'd witnessed pressing down on them like a heavy fog. That night, as Brendan lay in bed, his phone buzzed with a new text message. He picked it up, his stomach dropping as he read the words on the screen. "I have what you're looking for." It was a warm, breezy evening in late July when Savannah, a young woman from Athens, Georgia, downloaded the Randonautica app. She'd been seeing posts about it all over social media, people claiming it could lead you to eerie or mysterious places nearby, sometimes with disturbing results. Savannah wasn't one to shy away from a thrill, and the idea of a creepy adventure intrigued her. After a few quick swipes and taps, the app was set up, and she typed in her intention as mystery, hoping it might lead her somewhere strange and unexpected. The coordinates that appeared on her screen directed her to a spot not far from her house, near a small creek on the outskirts of town. The location didn't seem too out of the ordinary, and she felt comforted by the fact that it wasn't isolated. Gathering her curiosity and a bit of nerve, she headed out, recording her journey with her phone to capture whatever she might find. As she walked, she could hear the faint sounds of crickets chirping and the rustling of leaves, but otherwise, everything was silent. When Savannah reached the spot, she found herself in a small clearing beside the creek. Tall grass surrounded the area, and a few broken tree branches scattered the ground, creating an eerie, quiet scene. She looked around, wondering if the app had somehow led her to the wrong place. But just as she was about to turn back, something on the ground caught her eye. Nestled among the weeds and dry leaves were a few pieces of crumpled paper. She crouched down, reaching out carefully to pick up one of the sheets. As she unfolded it, her stomach tightened. The paper was covered in childlike drawings, with messy scribbles and smudges, as if they'd been drawn by a young hand in a hurry. The drawings were strange. One showed a house with dark windows, surrounded by stick figures, their expressions twisted into distorted frowns. Another depicted a figure standing alone, shadowed and faceless, looming over a group of children who seemed to be running away. Savannah felt a chill creep up her spine as she took in each strange image. The style was crude and simple, but there was something undeniably unsettling about the twisted scenes they depicted, something that seemed far too dark for a child's imagination. Just as she was folding the papers back up, a faint, distant sound drifted through the trees. It was high-pitched, like a child's voice, and seemed to be calling out in a sing-song tone, almost like a taunt. Savannah froze, straining her ears, trying to determine where it was coming from. She glanced around, half expecting to see someone hiding behind a tree, watching her. But she was alone, the stillness around her amplifying the strange voice echoing through the woods. Her heart began to pound as the voice faded away, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Savannah's nerves were on edge, but curiosity pulled her forward. She couldn't shake the strange feeling that something or someone was watching her, hidden just beyond her line of sight. She cautiously scanned the surrounding trees, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Taking a deep breath, she decided to explore further, stepping closer to the creek's edge. Her feet crunched over dried leaves and twigs, the only sounds breaking the thick silence that had settled around her. As she moved further into the clearing, she noticed more papers scattered across the ground, half buried in the dirt. She bent down to pick one up, her hands shaking as she unfolded it. This one was even more disturbing, a crude drawing of a little girl with long black hair, standing alone in what looked like a forest. Her face was blank, save for two dark holes where her eyes should have been. Around her were strange symbols, spirals, and shapes that seemed haphazardly drawn yet eerily intentional, like a hidden message she couldn't quite decipher. Savannah swallowed, her throat dry, as she stared at the haunting image. The childlike simplicity of the drawing only made it more disturbing, as though a dark secret was hidden beneath each line. As she studied the drawing, the same eerie voice echoed through the trees again. It was closer this time, and though she couldn't make out the words, it sounded almost like laughter, childlike, yet somehow wrong, as if mocking her. Her grip tightened on the paper, and a cold wave of fear washed over her. Slowly, she straightened up, her eyes scanning the trees around her, trying to locate the source of the voice. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she took a hesitant step backward, feeling a creeping dread that she couldn't shake. Then, in the corner of her eye, Savannah noticed something she hadn't seen before. Nestled between the roots of a tree was a small, battered notebook, its cover smeared with dirt and the edges fraying. With her heart pounding, she knelt down and reached for it, her fingers trembling as she picked it up. The notebook felt cold and damp, like it had been lying there for a long time, hidden away from prying eyes. Flipping it open, she found pages filled with scrawled writing and more crude drawings. Each page seemed more sinister than the last, depicting scenes of shadowy figures, twisted faces, and dark, forbidding woods that resembled the clearing she was standing in. Strange phrases were written between the drawings, phrases like, "Play with me, and I'm still here," scratched into the paper as if by a desperate hand. Her hands shook as she turned each page, feeling a growing sense of unease, as if the notebook itself carried a dark energy. Just then, the laughter echoed through the trees once more, closer and louder, now unmistakably the voice of a child. Savannah's breath hitched and she froze, clutching the notebook to her chest. The laughter faded, replaced by an oppressiveness that seemed to press down on her, filling her with a deep primal fear. Savannah's heart pounded as she clutched the notebook, her mind racing. The quiet around her felt unnatural, like even the trees were holding their breath, waiting. She took a slow step backward, hoping to retreat to the safety of her car without drawing attention to herself, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from the shadows. The child's voice lingered in her mind, its mocking tone both haunting and chilling. She turned and began walking briskly down the path, her footsteps quick and uneven. But as she neared the creek's edge, a new detail caught her eye, one that made her blood run cold. Spread across a patch of dirt was a circle of stones, carefully arranged with a chilling precision. In the center of the circle lay more drawings, all of them depicting a dark, faceless figure with eyes that seemed to follow her no matter which angle she looked from. Each picture had a single phrase scrawled beneath it: "I see you." Savannah felt her throat tighten, her pulse thundering in her ears. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. As she stared at the images, something moved in the periphery of her vision, a flicker of movement among the trees. She whipped her head around, her breath hitching as she squinted into the shadows. For a moment, she saw nothing. But then, there it was again. A faint outline of a figure standing far off among the trees, just barely visible in the fading light. The figure seemed small, childlike, but it was impossible to make out any details. Savannah's blood ran cold as the figure took a single, slow step forward, its movements unnatural, almost jerky. Panic surged through her, and she backed away, clutching the notebook like a shield. Her breaths came in short, shallow gasps, and her vision blurred with fear. She didn't know what, or who she was looking at, but every fiber of her being told her that she was in danger. Without another thought, she turned and sprinted back toward her car, her feet pounding against the ground as she forced herself to keep moving. She dared not look back, afraid of what she might see. The path seemed to stretch endlessly before her, each step echoing through the oppressive silence that had fallen over the forest. She could still feel the weight of eyes on her, pressing into her back like an unseen force. When she finally reached her car, she yanked the door open and threw herself inside, slamming the lock button with trembling hands. For a few moments, she sat there, her chest heaving, trying to process what had just happened. She didn't dare look into the rearview mirror, too afraid of what she might find lurking behind her. Gripping the steering wheel, she started the car and sped away, the clearing disappearing into the darkness. Later that night, as Savannah tried to settle her nerves, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Her heart stopped as she read the message. "Did you enjoy our game?" It was an unusually quiet evening in Jasper, Alabama, when Megan and her friends decided to try Randonautica. They'd been scrolling through videos of strange and eerie discoveries people had made using the app, and curiosity had quickly turned to excitement. Megan, her roommate Liz, and their friends Amber and Callie were all looking for a little thrill to shake up their quiet Friday night. After setting up the app and entering fear as their intention, they gathered around Megan's phone, eagerly watching as the app generated coordinates for a location about 20 minutes away. The coordinates led them to an isolated dirt road on the outskirts of town, one that Megan hadn't seen before. despite living there most of her life. The road wound through thick, silent woods, with only the occasional glow of a streetlight breaking the darkness. As they drove deeper, the trees seemed to close in on them, their branches arching over the road like clawed fingers reaching for something, or someone. A thick fog rolled across the ground, clinging to the undergrowth, making everything look blurred and distorted. Finally, they arrived at the spot, a secluded clearing at the end of the dirt road. The forest seemed to watch them as they stepped out of the car, and an eerie silence settled over them, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and decaying foliage, a scent that seemed to cling to their clothes and seep into their skin. Megan felt a strange tension, as if something unseen was pressing down on them, urging them to leave. "Are we sure about this?" Amber whispered, her voice barely audible in the thick silence. Megan forced a smile, trying to ignore the growing knot of anxiety in her stomach. "It's just a random spot in the woods. We'll be fine," she replied, hoping her voice sounded more confident than she felt. They ventured further into the clearing, their footsteps muffled by the soft, damp ground. After only a few steps, Megan spotted something peculiar, an old, abandoned campsite tucked between a cluster of trees. Torn sleeping bags, empty cans, and scattered clothes lay strewn across the ground, as if whoever had been there had left in a hurry. The remnants were damp and rotting, with an air of abandonment that made Megan's skin crawl. She felt like they had stumbled upon something private, a place that wasn't meant to be found. Liz knelt down and picked up a piece of paper lying partially buried in the dirt. She brushed it off and squinted to read it. In a messy, scrawled handwriting, the note read, "If you're reading this, it's too late." Liz held it up to the others, her face pale. Megan felt her stomach drop, the words prickling at her nerves, but she tried to brush it off, telling herself it was just someone's twisted idea of a prank. But as they looked around, Megan noticed something else nearby, a trail leading deeper into the woods. The trail was narrow and overgrown, with branches tangled together overhead, casting long, twisted shadows on the ground. Megan hesitated, feeling a cold dread settle in her stomach, but the others, intrigued by the strange note, urged her forward. The four of them began down the path, stepping carefully over roots and rocks, their movements slow and deliberate as they navigated the darkening woods. Each step seemed to bring a deeper, heavier silence, as if the trees themselves were closing in, swallowing their sounds. They hadn't gone far when Amber noticed something hanging from a low branch up ahead. She pointed it out, and the group moved closer, their steps growing slower as they approached. Dangling from the branch was an old, tattered doll. Its face was smeared with dirt, one of its glassy eyes missing, leaving an empty, dark hole where an eye should have been. Its arms hung limply, and its clothes were torn, adding to its unsettling appearance. Megan felt a shiver run through her as she stared at it, an eerie sense of foreboding washing over her. "Who would leave this here?" Liz murmured, her voice barely audible. Megan shook her head, unable to answer. The doll seemed to watch them with its one remaining eye, the empty socket casting an uncanny gaze that made her want to turn around and run. But curiosity held her rooted to the spot, unable to look away. They continued down the trail, leaving the doll behind, but the sense of unease grew with every step. The woods felt darker here, as if the daylight was somehow being drained away. A dense fog settled in, snaking between the trees and creeping along the ground, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The shadows grew thicker, and every rustle of leaves or crack of a branch made them jump, each sound magnified in the unnatural stillness. As they moved deeper, the path began to open up, leading to a small, empty clearing. In the center of the clearing lay a circle of stones, carefully arranged in a way that suggested purpose, as if someone had deliberately placed each one. In the middle of the circle was a small pile of charred wood, remnants of what seemed to have once been a fire. Surrounding the fire pit were scattered remnants, a broken necklace, a pair of faded shoes, a half-burned journal. The items were personal, intimate, and somehow sinister in this context. Megan's heart raced as she took in the strange scene, feeling like they had stumbled upon something deeply wrong, something hidden and forbidden. Liz knelt down and reached for the journal, her fingers brushing against the burnt edges as she picked it up. She flipped through the charred pages, and they could just barely make out fragments of writing, disturbing phrases like, "Don't look back," and "I'm waiting." Her face paled, and she quickly closed it, glancing around as though she expected someone, or something, to emerge from the shadows at any moment. A chill ran down Megan's spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone in the woods. The heavy silence around them was oppressive, as though the very air was thick with something unseen, watching. Megan glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone lurking among the trees, but the woods were empty. Her nerves were frayed, every instinct screaming at her to turn and run. She looked at the others, noting the unease etched across each of their faces. "Maybe we should go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Just as they turned to leave, a sound shattered the silence. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like something hard knocking against a tree trunk. The noise was slow and deliberate, echoing through the dense trees with an ominous resonance. The girls froze, their breaths caught in their throats. The tapping continued, growing louder with each beat, and Megan's heart hammered in her chest. She couldn't see where it was coming from, but every nerve in her body told her that it was moving closer. Amber's voice was barely a whisper. "What? What is that?" But no one answered. They were all too terrified to speak, their eyes scanning the darkening woods, searching for the source of the sound. Suddenly, from the corner of her eye, Megan noticed movement, a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just barely visible among the trees. The figure was tall and thin, its form cloaked in shadow, with an unnatural stillness that made her skin crawl. She blinked, hoping it was a trick of the fading light, but the figure remained, unmoving, its head tilted as if watching them. Megan's breath caught in her throat, and her legs felt like lead, rooted to the ground by a primal fear she couldn't shake. Liz grabbed her arm, her fingers digging into Megan's skin as she whispered, "Run." Without hesitation, they all turned and bolted down the trail, their footsteps pounding against the dirt as they sprinted back toward the car. The shadows seemed to stretch out, chasing them, and the trees seemed to close in, narrowing the path as they ran. Their lungs burned, and their legs ached, but they didn't dare stop, too afraid of what might happen if they slowed down even for a second. The forest was alive with the sound of their panic, their breaths loud and ragged, mingling with the faint echo of that haunting tapping, now distant but still audible, as if it was following them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they broke through the tree line, and their car came into view. They scrambled inside, slamming the doors and locking them, their hands trembling. Liz started the car, and they sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. The figure was gone, but the sense of dread lingered, a heavy weight pressing down on them as they drove in silence, each of them struggling to process what had happened. Later that night, as Megan lay in bed, her phone buzzed with a message. She hesitated, dread pooling in her stomach as she opened it. The text was from an unknown number, and it read, "I'm still here. Don't look back."